Good afternoon, everybody. It's fabulous to be here today in this gorgeous garden with you poetry lovers and poetry writers. So thank you very much for coming out today to hear three fabulous poets. I'm very honored to be presenting them, and we'll be doing a couple of rounds of poetry with some questions in between. And just in preparation, there'll be index cards available for questions that we'll have at the end of the session. So if you have a question or think you might have a question, you can put up your hand and you'll get an index card so you can write down your question, which we'll read out near the end. So I believe Elisa has the index cards, and Alan can also point out where the index cards are. So without further ado, we have three wonderful poets here today. One of the poets couldn't attend, Steffi Tadi, but because up until yesterday we expected her to come, and I know that some of you may be quite disappointed that you won't be hearing from her today, I promised I would read one of her poems at the start of the session. Steffi is a poet that was born in the Philippines, and her debut book, From the Shoreline, is quite wonderful, and she has written about the diaspora and about colonialism and so forth. So I thought I'd start out with a poem, given that we are the products of a colonial construct here in Vancouver. Pre-existing conditions. When the teacher said the tragic and the comic are parts of the same whole, I laughed. More than 500 years ago, Spain and Portugal divided the world in half. As per creative advice, this needed embellishment. More than 500 years ago, Spain and Portugal divided the world in half. So it was not uncommon to hear, I own half of you. I am laughing, so I won't cry. Like a headstrong historian, I want to probe what centuries of being owned catapults into a psyche. But residing in Vancouver and spending time as a function of money, just plug in entities to replace Spain and Portugal for the moment. And most likely, the hustle leaves you a husk. Facing the bathroom mirror, say, subservience. A pill on the counter you swallow before daybreak. Subservience, 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 subservience. Until you arrive at subversive. Over and over across Mountain View Cemetery, over and over on Marpole, propped up on Lazy Boy and gazing at Monterona's paintings in the basement of a graying house on a plot that refused to be sold. I dreamt of coconuts, smashed and smashing on the ground. So that's Steffi Tadi's book. Hopefully there'll be other chances to hear her read and look at her poetry. In the meantime, we have the three poets here that I'm very much looking forward to introducing to you today. What we're going to do is, instead of me giving you three big, long bios, I'm going to read each bio in turn, and you'll hear from each of the poets. So we're going to start with David Lee. David Lee is the author of Mythical Man, 2020. And I'm a fan here. Here's his book, the first book. And this was shortlisted for the 2021 Relit Poetry Award. And then Dream of Me as Water, 2022, both published under the Ann Struther Books imprint of Palimpsest Press. He is the co-editor with Daniel Zamparelli of Queer Little Nightmares, an anthology of monstrous fiction and poetry, published by Arsenal Pulp Press in 2022. David's poems have appeared in multiple publications, such as ARC Poetry Magazine, the pinnacle of poetry magazines in Canada, Best Canadian Poetry, Prism International, and The Puritan, where he won the inaugural Austin Clarke Prize in Literary Excellence. David is the poetry editor of this magazine. David, would you read a few poems to start us off?
Sure. Thank you, Fiona, and for everybody who showed up today. I'll start off with 3 poems for Mythical Man as my first set. Can everyone hear me okay? This mic is very intimidating. It's very big. This one's called Nod and Be Polite. Being unnecessarily reminded to say hi to Grandpa again. Arm unnecessarily grabbed and shoulder slapped again. Hearing nostalgic stories about Vietnam again. Asked when I will get a girlfriend again. Reminding Grandpa that I won't ever have one again. Being told how going to Vietnam for a wife is the norm. Again, here. I'm from here. This next one is called Cry. Cry, and the devil limps over to you, bows to be crowned with white orchids. Blink the doubt from your eyes before it blooms on a black lake in the crater of a planetoid. For what it's worth, learn how to wear the glow of stars once they burn out. The trick is to know that a safe distance away from darkness won't help you see better. Instead, rip the sky down, origami fold it into a beetle, and slip it under your tongue. A star died 1 billion years ago, and tonight you are living in its afterglow like how a hound leaps through flames licking at its heels. Bravery is where you worry it might be. Let the devil cry on you. So the last poem is called Mythical Man 4. In this book, there are 4 sections to the book, and each has a mythical man poem in it, speaking to an aspect of masculinity, queerness. So this is the 4th mythical man. Echoing my ancestors, my hands rattle every reachable rusted lock. Beyond belonging, beyond what is understood, what can be created or destroyed. Thank you.
The next poet is Tariq Malik. For the past 4 decades, Vancouver-based BIPOC author Tariq Malik has worked across poetry, fiction, and visual arts to distill immersive and compelling narratives that are always original and intriguing. He writes intensely in response to the world in flux around him and of his place in its shadows. Born in Pakistani Punjab, he came reluctantly late to these shores. He is the author of short stories, Rain Songs of Kotli, Tsar Books 2004, a novel, Chanting Denied Shores, Bayou Arts 2010, and a poetry collection, of course, Exit Wounds, published with Caitlin Press last year. And he offers a poetry masterclass in conjunction with the Polyglot magazine. Welcome, Tariq.
I'm going to begin with a poem that I wrote on realizing that our airport is called Why We Are, which is why we are. So I said, okay, here's a poem that's waiting to be written down. Vancouver International Airport, Why We Are, for Robert Duzansky, whose last desperate and fatal act of defiance was brandishing a stapler at the airport security. I'm writing a longer poem on Robert Duzansky and the fiasco that happened at the airport. So this poem is divided into 2 parts, the arrivals, departures. I always look at international airports as something of a general hospital where you have obstetrics on one side where the people are coming into the world, arrivals, and then the departures, which is the palliative aspect. So think of this as the arrivals and departures, and this is a typical immigrant or a refugee arriving at the airport. Why we are here at the portal of arrivals. At this first portal, we enter into an imminent penumbral world where our exhalations are held in check. The future will not be born if the current world is not receptive. No heralds announce our arrivals. There are no more vacant concavities into which we can be extruded, gasping, clamoring, blue in the face, arriving only at this, our moment of birth in panic mode. Second part, why we are here at the portal of departures. We may have arrived alone, but here we emerge at the other end, only to slip away, unnoticed but escorted. Handcuffed, branded, invisible barriers ensuring the two ends never meet. And whatever happens to us in the interim will always take place behind tinted glass. Thank you. One more. Since it's the day of the coronation, I thought I'd select something on the empire that stole 34 trillion pounds between 1780 and 1939. And there's no mention of this anywhere else. 1 billion ships of Theseus. What compels every seventh person you meet to abandon their home and join the jostling billion to whom only denied shores beckon? Every refugee, migrant, asylum seeker is a veritable ship of Theseus, suspended between hearth and a destination that is not home quite yet. What do we know about this seventh person, thundering out to shore, mud-smeared, hearthless, ears ringing with the familiar and tired generational arguments, pockets stuffed with ashes of forgotten ancestors? The Gadri Babas still sing of breathing in the dust of my homeland, the dissolved bones of my elders. The ground shifts underfoot, and our armadas begin chanting every delivering tide. And here, amongst abandoned harvest fields, freshly mined nocturnally, how quickly migratory herds have learned to feed on hoof while testing the integrity of barbed wires with every savage tongue. Just last week, a stowaway casually tumbled out of an astonished English sky and landed on airport roofs in snapshot rigor mortis. Another spilled from an unclaimed suitcase navigating an arrival's baggage carousel. Perhaps we are all such unclaimed baggage, endlessly circling global carousels. Thank you.
Those images of the astonished sky and the migrants, of course, we're in the middle of a migrant crisis right now that will only be spiraling more. Our third poet today is all the way from Montreal, and I'm so excited that she has come to the West Coast. Welcome. Gillian C. is the author of multiple poetry collections, including Peeling Rambutan, Redrafting Winter, and Panicle, which were all finalists for the Quebec Writers Federation A.M. Klein Prize for Poetry. Her latest book, Quiet Night Think, surprise, was shortlisted also for the same prize, and recently, very recently, won the 2023 Pat Lowther Memorial Award. Congratulations. Yes. This is a very important prize for women poets. Gillian has also written books for children. Her writing has been translated into Slovenian, Italian, French, Turkish, Hebrew, Spanish, and Greek. Originally from Winnipeg, she now lives and teaches in Montreal. Gillian.
Thank you so much, Fiona, and thank you, LiterASIAN, for inviting me. This is the first time I've been invited to read in Vancouver, so this is really, really special. I've come very often in the past to visit family, but now I have a nice, cool professional reason to be here. I'm so delighted to finally meet Tarek and David as well, and you as well. Just to double check, is it still 2 rounds of readings? Okay, so I'm going to read from an older collection, Peeling Rambutan. It's a book that documents my first experience of China, and because there are so many, subjects here that I think are relevant, like place and belonging and identity, I thought I'd read from here. So I'll read the very first poem. It's a prose poem entitled "East is a Sun Behind a Tree." An old saying, if you never reach the Great Wall, you're not a real man. If a bird relieves itself on your head, eat a bowl of noodles before entering your home. River water doesn't bother the water in the well. The first words in Chinese were written on oracle bones and tortoise shells. Peace is a woman rooted beneath a roof. Brightness is the sun beside the moon. Leisure is moonlight through an open gate. East is the sun behind a tree. The Chinese character for good is a woman with a child. A newborn cried in the next room, and someone whimpered back to life. My grandfather took off decades before I was born. Spring bamboo shoots after the rain. A father, I once read, is a necessary evil. Sorrow becomes a friend if it hangs around long enough. The doctor in Shanghai prescribed a recipe for soothing rub, a litter of baby mice soused in a jar of alcohol. My father's first boarding home in Winnipeg was off Jubilee near the train yard. He lived in the attic, and the sound of locomotives kept him up. In 1978, houses are more affordable than cars. He believed in fate because 2 people who were wrong for each other marry anyway. According to the Chinese almanac, the day I was born was a favorable day to start a business, get married, and worship ancestors. It was an unfavorable day to take medicine, see a doctor, garden, plant, plow, hold a funeral, or build a house. As children, we learn to detect evil spirits. If suddenly the sun is robbed and everywhere grows quiet, you must drop your pants, squat, and piss to save your life. I measured my goodness by the number of times I swore. We wrapped dumplings and sealed them by dipping our fingers into a shallow dish of water. My hands were too clumsy to fold sweet rice into bamboo leaves. My mother tied the string so it came undone neatly in one pull. The women told me to have a bowl full of red bean soup after the month's blood to replenish. Girls develop a taste for bitter melons only after they wed. We believed in a rabbit that lived on the moon. I feared death when I learned of black holes. A fortune teller told me I'd marry late. Another told me to stay away from water. If you look at plums, you can stop the thirst. When I cut mushrooms, I lay out their caps, flat and tan, a gentle color. Thank you. And I'll read one more from this book. I was really actually inspired because Fiona mentioned, it's a really great question I think everyone in this room probably experienced before, where are you from? And I wrote a poem actually entitled that. He asks, where are you from? And so this is a bit of a coy response. This poem is a coy response to that question. So, answer. I am from 5 seconds ago. I am from a few pages back. I am from this door I just closed and from the street below. 80% of what I say is from A to Z, the rest is just pictures. But if you want to talk about the beginning, I suppose I am made from scratch. I am from the horse's mouth. I am from pillar to post. When someone asked me if I were from there, I said, me, I'm from here. And he called me the daughter of the soil. So I guess from ground up, I am from mud and earth. I am from lime and loam. I am from time to time and from all sides. From now on, hear me when I say that I was once from hence, from thence, from whence. Now I am hither, thither, whither. Thank you.
Thank you for that segue, because that is one of the main questions I had. Well, I have several main questions. How can that be? But the other poets here have also written poems about answering that question. I'm sure many of us in this room have dealt with that question, where are you from? Where are you really from? And having an answer to that through poetry is a very good way to ponder that and have that smart comeback. If only we could memorize that poem and the person who was receiving it would stand there and receive it, right? Not likely. Anyways, in terms of origins and where are you from and home, could each of you sort of talk about how you explore that in poetry, other than using, where are you from as a poetry prompt, which is an excellent poetry prompt for anyone in the room as well. David, did you want to talk about origins, where are you from, home, and place, having a role in your poems?
Yeah, sure. So that's a big question.
You can choose one.
I think the role it has in my poetry is my attempt at trying to avoid answering the question, because I was asked it so much, I think. So Mythical Man was written kind of in response to those poems. And like Jillian, I have a poem in Mythical Man where I would receive messages from guys on like dating apps, and they would ask, where are you from? And I would take their message and make it into a poem. But then I got really tired of doing that and having to talk about it all the time. So in response to further answering that question in Dream of Me as Water, I moved beyond that, or tried to move beyond that, and kind of talk about where I'm from isn't necessarily meaning where I'm from, like kind of, my racial background. It's kind of what I construct for myself, given where I've come from. Because being born here in Canada, but raised by, I guess, first generation, it's a bit confusing with my family, but I'm basically torn between like living kind of again with the ideals of where my family was raised and kind of what I've learned for myself in Canada. And how I explore that in my poetry, at least in Dream of Me as Water, is using water as the metaphor for it all, and how water and myself can kind of fit a mold if I'm put into it, or kind of free flow where I want, if that answers the question.
I think using water as a theme, I mean, we think about the 4 elements. Some say there's 5 elements, but the 4 elements in many cultures of water, fire, metal, wood. Some other cultures add air. But really, our place is embodied, right? And I feel that your poems are embodied. There's the subconscious, there's the conscious, there's dreams. The sense of pop culture is place. So place can be broadly defined.
Yeah.
I think water is a lovely portal into your poems in this particular collection. Tarek, do you have any comment about origins, given that you have been through many different countries, different wars, and challenges?
Well, for me, I think my search for where I am from begins when I was about 6 years old, because I was sent to an English boarding school. So having left at that age, all my journey has been search for that home. And having lived in 3 different countries, gone through 3 wars, been a refugee, and done all these things and traveled and migrated, I turn that question around every time somebody asks me, where are you from? It just triggers me in a way, because I become that boy, 6-year-old boy, asking, where are my parents? Where's my home? When do I go back? Will they come for me? And so the person who is asking it is actually hinting at something bigger than we can answer at any point. And there's a lot of backstory to it, but I think my writing is all a response to that, and it's also a search for home.
Yes, and you have a wonderful poem about that question and responding to it as well. Yes. And Gillian, in your book, I noticed that you describe a trip to Fujian province. Your parents were from Fujian, and then that question, does she speak English and does she speak Chinese, comes up. Did you want to talk about the origin story?
Yeah, so I wrote, so that poem, Where Are You From, comes from Peeling Rambutan, and I actually talk about my process about writing that book in Quiet Night Think. I think during that period of my life, I think it really came to a head. As everyone else mentioned, this is a question you get all the time. They want to know where you're from. The answer you provide is just never good enough, right? Where you're from is not the same as your parents. And even just this point of origin becomes conceptual, like it is beyond place, it is beyond geography. So when I took this trip and I was abroad, I think was really reflecting on how growing up as a visible minority in Winnipeg, I never looked like I quite belonged. And then as an Anglophone moving to a French province, the question would be like, well, do you speak French? Do you even speak English, right? And then suddenly, I'm excited to visit, Hokkien, where my parents and my family are from. And I think I'm going to see these people and they're going to look like me. And they look at me and they just can tell right away, like some sort of magic power. Like they can tell right away, oh yeah, you're not from here. You look like North American. And so I really had this sense of just not belonging anywhere. So this question of where you're from is really, I think, a larger question of where do you belong? And I think I really turned to writing and just realizing like poetry is kind of the place. Writing is a place where I belong. And so that's how that happened, I guess.
Yes, poetry is where we belong, you belong. And speaking of poetry being a place of belonging, how would you say you have, before we go into our second set of poems, used poetic form to express what you want to express? I loved also, before I launch into this more, Gillian has this great quote by Rilke about how poems are not simply feelings, they are experience. They're about experience too. So how do we use those feelings and experience and turn them into poems on the page? David?
I think for me it's the trick of kind of distancing myself from the experience when writing about them in poetry, either through making the narrator or the voice in a way kind of not me. I don't know if that makes sense, but when I'm writing a poem, it's never kind of me talking directly. It's often like a character or a voice I construct that carries through most of the poems, I think. Yeah, so I think it would be just too hard to write about it directly, and I think if I did, it wouldn't be a poem. And yeah, like Gillian said, I wish I took that answer, that poetry feels like the place where we belong, or writing in general, creative writing, and doing that in my poetry is a way to approach writing about experiences. Yeah.
And I noticed that with some of your poems, because it's a water-themed book, there's a lovely shape to some of your poems. Did you come to that intentionally, making that shape, or did you add that shape after seeing the flow within the language?
Yeah, so I really wanted to play with form with my poetry in Dream With Me as Water, because the poems in Mythical Man were very, just pretty like typical couplets or a block of text, but in Dreaming as Water, I felt like I had this, I would be missing an opportunity if I didn't make the poem about eels to look like an eel. And like, yeah, it was just a way for me to play on the page and to write about my experiences in a creative way. Yeah.
Yeah, if you get a chance, and I hope you will take a look at David's book, there's this lovely sinuous flow, and then there's a sinuous imagery throughout. So there's a lovely confluence right there.
Thanks.
And how about you, Tarek? You use form in interesting ways. There's some of his poems in his book are black pages with white. You can show that up. Now, how did you use form, and why did you decide to do that?
Yeah, thank you. So for me, I think I came to poetry, I think of it as an emotional landscape. and it's also something of a daily prayer. This is my daily practice of writing something out, usually at 2 o'clock in the morning. Much to my consternation of my wife, she keeps saying, "You're awake all the time. Are you having an affair?" Yes, with poetry. So poetry is an emotional landscape that I inhabit. But I came at poetry through rage. And my rage is based on the fact that I could not get published in BC for 20 years. My first book came out in 2003, and I couldn't get a publisher locally. And the Rain Songs of Coatley, various facetious comments about where's Coatley, what is Coatley. We don't care, we don't know. It's like asking where is Macondo, where is Guwahati, or something like that. And it took me 20 years before BC would actually publish me. And then they published me with this. But when I was writing this, I was fuming that I've wasted so much time not being able to express myself. So one of the things I was doing while doing that was breaking the language. I began writing without syntax, without punctuation, trying to break from the tyranny of capital I, for instance. And I was writing the pages with, and luckily I found a publisher who would let me do that. So the book, all the poems are differently constructed, like they are concrete poetry mostly. And I use caps very selectively, I use bold very selectively. And so if you look at the book is sometimes, it just moves on and off in various directions. But behind it all is a rage that flows with the poem. And each poem dictates its direction, that I will not flow left aligned. I will not flow aligned. So I keep breaking my own rules constantly. For instance, in this poem that is called Midnight on Turtle Island, this is about 100 years of First Nations children being stolen. It's midnight. So I do the introduction, and there are 3 people who are talking. It's dialogue. I didn't know how to write without saying he said, she said, they said, how to align this. So I began with center aligned, left aligned, right aligned, and leave it up to the reader to figure out. But then we come to the century of the night, and this is the century of the night.
It's cool. It's so cool what you can do with poetry, right?
And Caitlin would let me do that. They would let me leave space blank. The poem's not over as yet.
Yes.
And then I come back into the morning when we celebrate our emergence. And here it is. We are back into white.
Poetry is so malleable. It's a wonderful home that we can make to fit and suit where we are at any particular moment. And Gillian, poetic form, speaking of space on the page, it reminds me of that incident you describe in the book of your dad getting your dissertation and looking at it and going, it's half empty, where's all this white space here? Can you talk about form and your use of form?
Yeah, I'll just even expand on that story. So my MA thesis, it was done at Concordia, and when it's returned to you, it's like beautifully bound in this red hardcover. There's like gold writing, your name is on it. And I was really proud to go back to Winnipeg and hand it to my parents and my father. It's poetry, so there's like verse, right? It doesn't reach the ends of the margin. He's just like, and the spine is still very stiff because it's so freshly printed. And he's like, oh, it's all blank. There's nothing here. You know, that was like the result of my MA studies. And I was like, actually, Dad, you might. Well, I come to form, and I love what you said, Tarek, about like form and rage, you know, taking shape even in the line. I've always been fairly experimental with forms. I think in my books you'll see, you know, where I pay attention to line breaks, where I have prose poems. I think Quiet Night Think is my most, I think it's the busiest book. It was originally supposed to be a book of essays. It was supported by the Quebec Arts Council, and I pitched it as a book of essays, but In the end, it has everything. It has prose poems and shorter poems and a long poem at the very end. I also include some translations of my uncle's Chinese poetry, and they're printed sideways. And the reason I did that was because, Chinese poetry is very, very succinct, and so I wanted to maintain his couplets. But the publishers told me right away, if we don't have that sort of width, and so will you be okay with, breaking the lines? But then I thought just visually it would take away from the original, and so I said, can you just turn it landscape? So, but I've always enjoyed playing even with closed forms. There's a villanelle in here. I've worked with high buns. I've worked with sonnets. I also like to, work within those constraints and experiment with those as well. So.
Yes, whatever's organic to the words that are emerging, the images that are emerging.
Yeah.
So in this next round of reading, listen to how the poets have used poetic form. You'll hear it in their voices, where that turn is, where the space is when they're pausing. Poets use their words, the white space, in a very careful way on the page that can also be heard. So take it away, David.
Okay, just 1 second here. I want to read this poem first from Dreaming of His Water. It's nothing special, it's just couplets, but I want to start off with it. It is called Autobiography as a Thunderstorm. Listen to how quiet I am after admitting that I am afraid of thunderstorms. It's hard to discern hail from the rain smacking the window while I lie in bed thinking of my mom mentioning that my fear of rain came from a past life where I died as a soldier fighting during a storm, unable to tell the difference between bullets and hail hitting metal as I lost blood. I can't fall asleep, so I head to the couch debating if listening to Thunder by Imagine Dragons is too on the nose for tonight. I recall telling you that I love windstorms, but only during the daytime, and imagine dragons responsible for them when they take flight, creating gusts to remind us that they still exist. I'm glad you indulge my theory, and yes, a vast imagination is one thing I'm glad flows in my family. A boom is struck, brightening my living room with a flash. The window sounds close to shattering. Wind howls and hail moves bullet-like against the glass. Memory may not be generous for a second time if I carry too much of myself into the next life. So in this book, I got the chance to explore a lot of creatures that I really love, water creatures. And this poem is called Eels. And on the page, I managed to make it look kind of slithery looking. It is a result of not knowing how to put eels into a poem after months of thinking about them. I get out of bed and cough eels into the bathroom sink. Baby eels squirm out of bloodshot eyes. I see eels when showering, writhing in water that falls off my body. Eels are caught in the cotton while I towel off. Eels are stirred into tea. I sip and my tongue is an eel. Eels squirm down my throat where they become words. I keep smashing eels into the keyboard to get them out of my mind. But I still feel them eeling through the grooves of my brain, like yesterday, because yesterday was an eel, and my dream, amore, biting my hand and pulling me into its second set of eely jaws. One last poem, and it's basically an answer to the question of where are you from? If I can find it. I really should have tagged it. called Same Ocean. All right, found it. Thank you, Fiona. I did take it. Same Ocean. Years after being asked, "Where are you from?" I realized that I should have answered, "Did you know that when seawater meets fresh water in the ocean, a boundary forms between them? Though they appear to not be mixing, it does happen, slowly and over time, two bodies, two places of belonging coming together. Despite efforts to keep us apart, to manifest an individual way of being, the parts that make up who we are, in a sense, are parts of the same ocean. There is no other way to think about this metaphor. Only a grandfather who rigged his boat with a tractor engine to give the family a better life, speeding across water with a few belongings, carrying an ocean's worth of culture that's filtered down generationally. When I'm asked where I'm from, again, I'd say that a man once dreamed of more before turning his gaze towards the ocean, where two different bodies of water met and blended until he made landfall, attempting to walk forward, knowing that his existence was forever bound to two places. Thanks.
So I'm going to read two very brief poems, and then I'm going to go up to the dais and do a performance poem. Okay, thank you. This one's called Two Poems, titled Monopoly of Ink. The kleptomaniacs had always coveted the lilt, resonance, pitch of my speech, and left me unable to speak of their denouement. They cut out my mother tongue and left me theirs. It does not fit my mouth. It pours lead into every ear. It robs my dreams of color. Instead of green sap rising, there is now this gray metallic tang and the resounding of steel. Hear all my rain songs shrivel. How do I now speak to my mother or sing homespun lullabies to my unborn? How will I daily shape these stones to earn my keep? This was more about my language of Punjabi, my mother tongue, which was taken away by the English. English replaced it with Urdu and then English itself. So I'm unable to talk to my mother because Punjabi is not taught. Second one. And now that my tongue has regrown, I speak hybridity and am of numerous minds. Here, here, and here. And must now learn to break through this chokehold over ink, over eyes, over ears, over mouths, where my cry begins as a whimper and becomes a scream that no one wants to hear, where oceans of ink are spilled to tell only one story over and over, everywhere and forever. Just one more. So bear with me for this one. It's more a rehearsal for tomorrow, but I'm going to read this the best. What I intend to do is to have 8 stones placed in front of me, pebbles. Every insult hurled at an immigrant is a stone. And I'm going to have 8 stones here, and I'm going to throw them at the audience and try not to flinch. Entry, / exit wounds. So the title poem. It's a very brief poem. In memoriam for Chin Banerjee, 1940 to 2020. And I'm going to quote Faiz Ahmad Faiz, my favorite poet, Urdu poet. जिस तरह बंद दरवाज़ों पे गिरे बारिश संग, means the rain of stones on a door, people throwing stones at the door. This is what he's writing about. The poem breaks form in the sense that the large words, smaller, 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 these are taken from 8 different cultures dealing with the immigrant. So the first stone, Muhajir, Panagir, Rafiq, Paki, immigrant, refugee, wetback, FOTB. It is midnight already. Tell those who hurl stones at my window panes, heed your words. Go home.
Thank you. Very powerful. Very powerful. Looking forward to the more stones tomorrow.
I just said I'm so glad I won't be in the audience for that. I think because we're talking about forms, I think I'll read 3 poems that I've written in 3 different forms. So this book is about origins, both familial and cultural. It's a book that's very much centered on early motherhood, because I became a mother and then I had this identity crisis where I was trying to find my way back to writing. So these 3 poems pertain to writing. And I'll begin with a prose poem entitled Nursery. Nursery. These days I am overwhelmed by the task of constructing a world, to prepare a space for you, or maybe to prepare you for what's already out here. You float in me in want of nothing, oblivious to the evening news, the pilot who just the other day simply aimed for the mountainside, oblivious to all of the stolen girls, the bounty of heartache. Lately your father's rage curls around my feet. My nose now bleeds when I cry. Even our home suffers from insomnia and a domestic rhythm that can edge on boredom. I sit on the floor and select what I can to urge you forward without falsehood. Here is a color green. Here is the delayed tang of cranberries on the tongue. Here is a rough bark of a fallen branch. Here is a feather, light enough to articulate the stillness of the air. Thank you. I'm going to read a boob poem. So I live in Montreal, not too far from St. Joseph's Oratory. So if you ever fly into Montreal, you'll see, the dome. And I lost a lot of sleep nursing my kids, and so I would be very tired in the mornings, and then I would, turn the corner on the street, and I would see this dome of St. Joseph's Oratory in the distance, and to me it just looked like a giant boob. So naturally I wrote a poem about it. So it's called Queen Mary Road, and this is written in free verse. Veined and clamped to the season, the city is asleep on her back, upturned breast, there's no way to turn from the exposure, unflinching beneath fog. The light slips along the oratory's dome, milky and sore-quarried. A trace of the baby's cry left meandering through the night. As I retreat into the sun and down the papal road, where the shadow of my worn bosom, unmissable, takes shape. Thank you. I'll finish off with a closed form, a villanelle poem. So the villanelle is an Italian form consisting of 19 lines. There's a very particular A-B rhyme scheme and 2 refrains. Interesting fact, my first picture book, The Night is Deep and Wide, is written in the villanelle form because, well, when anyone repeats anything, it's just boring. So I thought it would be useful to lull a child to sleep that way. So this one's entitled Babel. A speck, a gravity hauled out from sea, shapes no words, dissolves to sound. It twirls its hair in its sleep. Every day it swivels to speak and tests the banks of volume's bounds, a speck, a gravity made of the sea. We commune in clues and ums and he's until pearled eve comes round. It twirls its hair in its sleep. With each utterance I recede, my glossary loses ground. A speck, a gravity mislays the sea. Break my heart in 2 or 3, in words that silt up astound. For now it twirls its hair in its sleep. It's too late, there's no release. Already the script is mispronounced. A speck of sea twirls his hair and sleeps and dreams of gravity. Thank you.
Yes. And villanelles are not easy to write, so that's a real feat there. And, you know, so many people think poetry has to rhyme, right? And you can show them, like, yeah, I can rhyme, but I don't have to rhyme as well. So what's very cool with the set that we've just heard is that we've heard how poems can be about anything, really. And they can take different forms. They can be more spoken word, they can be performative, they can be villanelles, they can be weaving on the page like an eel. What really strikes me with these 3 poets is their incredible versatility, their incredible creativity with words. And each book is just chock full of fascinating examples that show this. So my last question before we open up to questions, and again, put your hand up if you want an index card from Elisa behind there. She'll give you an index card. You can write your question. It will be handed to me after we have this other round of questions and answers from me. Some people have asked me, and I'm sure they've asked you, about the inspiration, the portals into poetry. And we've already heard about how the Oratoire Saint-Joseph looks like a big boob, and how, you know, the eels. In David's book, we've got Instagram horoscopes and essential oils and those wonderful Himalayan salt crystals and so forth. And Tarek, you've got incredible array of terrific poets. You've got Tagore, and you've got Ghalib as well. And then Gillian has poems that have tidbits that refer to Emily Dickinson's letters. There's Godzilla. We've got a Godzilla aspect in one of the poems. So really, poems can be from anywhere and everywhere. So David, can you talk about how you get inspired? Do you take a little notebook around you, or do you write on your phone, or how will a poem begin?
I used to take a notebook, but then I found it was a bit cumbersome. So I use my phone now to jot down lines or titles or just phrases that come to me. But yeah, I think a lot of my poems that you've mentioned kind of touch on pop culture and things that resonate with me, just because they're just most relevant to me. And like music is a big one. I listen to a lot of music when I write. I'll always quote a Lana Del Rey song in my poem. Lately it's been Florence and the Machine. But yeah, so it's just stuff that I find fun to engage with, and that's pop culture for me. And I find that when I get it right, or I can strike that balance between something quite poignant and emotional, but speaking to something ridiculous, like that I think is ridiculous, like salt crystals, pink salt lamps. I think this is a balance that I can tread there, and it's fun to see how far you can push that, and do a commentary on it, but also speak to something a bit unexpected.
Yes. I think poetry can be fun, folks. It can be fun, it can be humorous, and lead to very deep, profound things. You just don't know. It's a door into the unexpected. Tarek.
So while we were talking, I was taking some notes. The words that prompted me were Himalayan salt. And the question that why is Himalayan salt never sold as Pakistani salt? It is Pakistan salt, but it's never labeled that. And there's a reason. And then my mind goes back to the Himalayas, where the salt mines are. And if you visit them, there's this whole essence that comes out, essence of a place that travels the whole world under different brands. It's like an immigrant salt or something. The other idea which came up, where are you from, where we started this conversation, I started writing a poem very quickly, and it began with, I'm a Pacific salmon that began in the boreal forest. So ideas can inspire, encountering salt water for the first time. So we are sweetwater fish. When they come down to Vancouver, they encounter salt water for the first time. And that is another simile for immigration. You're encountering a different world and you need to change. So then they start transforming their body to adjust to that saline environment. A poet or an immigrant is exactly that. You are accommodating, you're constantly transforming yourself, and your journey is transformative because you are undergoing these changes. You're adjusting sometimes to the sweet water and sometimes to the saline water.
Yes, yes, and the poet has to be very aware and respond to that and listen. And Julian, you talk about listening as well in your work, and you've written about many different things as well. What are your portals? What's your inspiration?
I would say everything.
Yeah.
I would say everything. Like even this moment and learning about eels. And now I want to put an eel in a poem, and just even this, like the mistakes even in language that Tarek brings up, Himalayan versus, Pakistani salts. I think that's really, it's very fruitful. So I find inspiration everywhere. I think that's part of being a writer, is just being attuned to the world around you. So images, I think concrete images often features in my work. The things I read, the things I hear, just to give some concrete examples, because I know there are some writers in this room, and just, one thing I get my students to do, for example, I'll just send them off and I'll say, find an object and just write about it, and they'll go around on campus and they'll find the most amazing things. I think one student found like this broken piano in a woodworking, shop. I didn't even know we had a woodworking shop on campus, but there it was, and it became a story. Someone couldn't find anything and just looked up, and the panels from the ceilings were taken away, and so they just wrote about nothing. I get them to eavesdrop as well, and so really, finding these sort of encounters can be, very fruitful, I think, for a writer. So. My short answer is everything.
Yeah, that's perfect, because there's the ekphrastic, looking at art, and yes, the broken panels on the ceiling, and the overheard conversations. Yes, poetry exists everywhere. Metaphors exist everywhere if you have your eyes and ears and senses open and listening to the potential. So let's look at some of the questions that we've received from the audience here. Okay. This one, I love how Tarek called his daily writing practice a daily prayer. Could you please all speak to your daily writing practice and how you make time for poetry in your daily lives? Who would like to start with that?
I'm still figuring that out, I think. I used to have a pretty set routine where I write late into the night, but I don't like staying up too late anymore. So... yeah, it's on and off a lot. When it's slow at my day job, I write during work. So, it just comes slower these days. So the routine, I'm still trying to settle into like a new writing routine and when the best time to write a poem is. But oftentimes lately, it's not too common that I have time. So I'll figure it out eventually.
I think it's an ongoing struggle, and there are phases, right? Yeah. Right? It's not like suddenly the poet's living in a garret and getting a Canada Council grant and living off cereal for 5 months. No, sometimes it's squeezed in. And Jillian, of course, with children and nursing and the struggle to write, talking about that. What's your way of making space for poetry?
I think it's when I can. I think I really realize the finitude of everything after having my kids. You know, there's just finite time, finite energy, and so I write when I can. I do have to carve out that space and time, and sometimes it is at night at 2 in the morning, just because there are just fewer demands at night. You know, the only expectation is you have to sleep. You know, there isn't anyone pawing at you to be fed or wiped, you know. And so I think my writing routine is when I can take advantage of commutes. I take advantage of, you know, even waiting for my kids to come out of school, for example. Keeping a mental log, even just walking when I drop my daughter off at daycare, just being observant. And I do carry a notebook. I used it often before having kids, but then because, you know, when you nurse, it's often in the dark. And when you're on the go, you know, the phone is handy. The Notes app is very, very handy. And so you find out you're just taking notes there just for efficiency.
Do you find that reading poetry helps facilitate the writing of poetry as well, to keep you in the mindset?
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
So if you don't have time to write, read. Read a book of poetry, a poem or two, and that'll give you so many ideas. Tariq, how about this daily prayer? I saw the writing mention that you're in that sort of liminal state between waking and sleep. So this is habitual. You do this every day.
I think it's a good tool. Everyone should try and practice that when you're in between sleep and waking, there's this subliminal world which opens certain portals into your brain that you can write, as long as you don't have your wife or husband bugging you or your partner telling you. You're all alone, there's a bird singing. There's actually a hemlock outside my window, and 2 o'clock it starts singing. And I keep thinking, what on earth at 2 o'clock, whom are you communicating with? And the same line again and again. So it doesn't take that bird to get you going, but like you saw, by the time we have been sitting here, there have been sources for 3 or 4 poems. So be in the presence of people who inspire you. I'm at Kogawa House once we have our weekly poetry writing. We don't talk to each other. We're just in the presence of, there's a certain frisson that happens when we're all together. It doesn't have to be physically you doing something. You're in the presence of people whose minds are spinning, and it inspires you to write. And that's it. We write and we go home. We don't share. So look for places that inspire you or people who inspire you. And Kogawa House, the poetry sessions are an excellent place to be in.
Good advice, good advice. It's to be really, really present, not distracted, even for a short time. And also, for you poets out there, or nascent poets, is if that line, that idea comes to you, capture it any way you can, because otherwise it's going to go away and you're going to forget it, and then someone else will have it. So please, when you have that idea, mark it down somewhere, even the back of a receipt, dictate it, on the back of an index card or anything. Here's another question, places. What places have inspired some of your work? What places?
I'd like to go first.
Sure.
I'll forget it. Barbed wires. Being around barbed wires. Because I've been in 3 wars and lived in 3 different countries, I have had the fortune or misfortune of being a refugee, traveling, doing all that, and being around places that are no man's land. A no man's land is a sight to behold, because it literally is a no man's land. But they want to keep you out of that. So there are barbed wires on this side, that side, and in between there is this terra incognita. And that's what inspired me to write a lot of my poetry. Barbed wires.
I think for me, the place that inspires me when I'm writing poetry is when I feel like I'm alone. Like when I have the space to myself, and I kind of really know the distractions, I think. But yeah, so I think it's the space, the places like in my mind that I kind of fall into, because my poems are I like to think of them as very imaginative and image-based, and I kind of get lost in that myself, and that's when I like to write. I think, yeah,
Well, the interior world is a rich, rich world.
yeah.
Yeah. Places?
I think everywhere, right now, here. Yeah, there's another short answer for everywhere, everything. There are a lot of places that are featured in my work. Winnipeg and Peeling, Rambutan, Vancouver's there. Places I visited abroad. Quiet Night, think there's a lot of nature imagery. I think it was because I was inside my home a lot with a newborn baby, so I just looked out the window. I'm thinking about my second book, The Anatomy of Clay. A lot of it was written while I was sitting on a bus. So, the urban subject was just, in these in-between spaces on the metro and on the bus. So I guess everywhere.
Yes. Yes. Do you remember the very first poem you ever composed, David? The very first poem.
I think so, yeah. It was a shorter one. It's in Mythical Man. It's called For the No Rice, No Spice kind of guy. And it goes, it's just like the poetry of his jawline falls apart when he opens his mouth. And that was kind of the first one that I wrote. I was like, okay, I think that's a poem. So,
Yes.
yeah.
Excellent. Tara, do you remember your first poem?
I curate everything, but this is one thing that I've lost. I think it was probably a very bad poem, which is why I can't remember.
That's okay. But when did you write it?
It would have to be when first time I went to Kuwait in 1975. And I was going through the trauma of having lost my father and being in a foreign land.
So a poem of loss.
Sitting, yeah.
Jillian?
I like that your poem of loss is lost.
Yes.
Yeah, I too can't quite recall it. I feel like it was probably a bad poem sometime in junior high. I probably abandoned that and started writing shorter fiction before really pursuing poetry a little more seriously later. But,
Sure.
yeah. Mine is also lost.
That could be a great poetry prompt, the lost poem. Which leads me to the next question. What are some of your favorite writing prompts? They could be ordinary objects, could be photographs.
Ekphrastic poetry is something I encourage all of my students to do. So ekphrasis is just a fancy way of saying, poetic responses to visual art. So when I teach a creative writing class, I usually incorporate one of those. What was particularly useful when I was teaching online was Google Arts and Cultures. You can explore any art gallery or museum around the world and access any number of artworks. And I find that a great source of inspiration because the hardest part is always starting. But if you don't actually have a blank page, you're kind of halfway there. So it's my trick.
A lot with prompts. I think most recently, one of the prompts I had was just writing a poem for a magazine that CV2 was doing an animals issue, and I just thought that was a perfect prompt for me to write about. But I don't think I usually do prompts, just kind of like ideas that I tell myself. Like, I think oftentimes I want to write about something supernatural in like a regular setting, and how that can be kind of just kind of casual. I think that's always a fun prompt for me to write about.
Now, that anthology you edited had the reference to monstrous things. What's that about?
Oh, yeah. So the Queer Little Nightmares anthology was an anthology that I co-edited with my friend Daniel Zombrelli. And it was just a bunch of queer poets and short story writers. And we pooled them all together, just give them the prompt of writing an homage or just kind of any piece a short story or a poem to your kind of favorite monster and how it spoke to queerness and that. So that was a fun prompt actually to write with.
Favorite monster,
Yeah.
I love it.
Yeah, there was a lot of Medusa poems that I went through, and yeah, it was good. It was a good prompt.
Yeah. And how about you, Tarek?
I was going to show this image. This is an image of, the minute I saw this image, I said, I've got to write something about it. This is the only image you'll see of a white person without shoes. This is taken about 2 centuries ago. It's a colonizer, a British soldier or British officer, receiving a pedicure while another local is standing there with a fan. So I started thinking of this man, and I said, good God, this is like the Nawab, the stately princes. And the poem is called The New Nabob. They used to call them Nabob because they refused to learn the words the locals were using. They made it into Nabob. The new Nabob only drinks yak milk. He's not going to drink milk because it's so common, buffalo milk and all. He only drinks yak milk. So I wrote this 2.5 pages of a poem based on this image. So images inspire. Ekphrastic, again, we're back to ekphrastics.
You can find images anywhere, a history book, the newspaper, online or in print. Those ideas are everywhere. The other question I want to ask is about poems and that continuum of poetics into prose. Could you talk about that? Poetry versus prose?
Jillian is the best answer.
I was trying to avoid being first. So that's a really great question. It's something that comes up a lot about this book in particular because it is a mix of essays and poems. I do often just cater to what I think the work needs in terms of its form, in terms of its shape. So it takes multiple drafts to figure out, do I need to pay attention to line breaks and the breath? Do I need to pay attention to just the sentence? The first piece that's written in this book is the title essay, Quiet Night Think. And that was actually a prompt that was given to me, which was, write about writing. And so I had this memory of learning Li Bai's poem. And in order to really tell that story, I think I needed the sentence. I needed to turn back to narrative. And so these essays, I think, were the right forms for what I needed to do in terms of accommodating the research, in terms of accommodating the stories and histories that I wanted to share. I did feel, and I'm really curious about what the other poets say about this, I felt really vulnerable writing essays, writing prose. I think it's just even like the way it looks on the page, it's so present, right? Whereas with a poem, there are these wonderful white spaces that I can kind of disappear from. And I feel, and some would say that poems are more vulnerable than prose, but I found writing in sentences, I felt really naked.
We have to show all the connections. In poems, you can make the leaps
That's
from
true.
stepping stone here
Yeah.
and there and dance with that. Whereas with prose, every sentence, every article and so forth,
I think
dealing with the grammar.
That's a great point. I think the I in a poem can be anyone, but the I in these essays is very much like Jillian.
The accountability for that. Yeah.
It's probably because it's usually an emotional response. So you're more vulnerable because of that.
And Tarek, you've used narrative in your short stories and your novels, so how does that translate with narrative
exactly.
and
I was going
poetry?
to start with, this was my first book. It was short stories, and I'm surprised now that we are talking about it. I realized that I began this as a poem, and I compressed it into prose. And people who have read it, they say, but this is poetry. Why? And I said, I didn't know that. I was writing prose. So the first few paragraphs began as poems, and then I compressed them into. So for me, there's no border, the borderline. I can easily switch between both.
That's like hard for me, because I'm just starting to try to learn to teach myself to write prose. And I think for me, the point where I thought what I had in mind needed to be in prose form versus poem was I felt the poem form would be too small to contain this image that I had that carried a lot of weight to it. Mm-hmm. And so that I experimented in opening up into prose. But you brought up a good point, Jillian, about the vulnerability of it. And I didn't think of it that way because when I started writing the novel, it was in first person and it just felt super weird. And like I could not, it just felt too close for me. Whereas I can write I in a poem and it's a bit more like, free who that I is. So switching to third person when writing in the prose was a lot easier for me to flesh out that image and the whole story around it. So.
Yes, changing point of view is this wonderful thing. It's like changing hats so you can put on when you're writing. So 2 questions here, bringing us up to the sort of bigger picture. How can poetry serve us in terms of social activism and protest? Maybe Tarek, you can start with that.
Well, my poetry is always about activism. I always try to highlight issues which have been ignored or something that we do not want to talk about. And I put the spotlight on that because I consider myself as someone who is writing from the shadows. My own writing or my experience has been ignored for so long that I'm acutely conscious that I have to educate, entertain secondly, and then elucidate, that I need to expand on certain issues. And that's what drives me to write. It doesn't matter what medium I'm using. I've switched between short stories, novels, to poetry. After doing my 3-4 books of poetry, I'll go back to the novel I've been writing for the last 5-6 years. And so that's what works for me.
Social activism before next question?
Social.
I mean, I think writing. I was just reminded of what David Miro was saying earlier in the panel, where he was just talking about writing just kind of from those liminal spaces, just like what Tarek is saying here. I think, people don't often express themselves. Like, that's it. Not that, especially in poetry. Just people don't always take note of what's around them or what they're feeling or processing events. They just move through the world, and there's no archiving, there's no reflection. And so even just that act of recording, the act of expressing, the act of sharing that work with others, I think is in itself political and social. So,
it is. I think even given that literature for a long time was not very inclusive, just the fact we are writing what we're writing is a very political act, a meaningful act, for sure. David, do you have any commentary? No?
Going off what Jillian said, I think the act of just reading poetry and getting it into hands of readers who don't necessarily read poetry, it's kind of challenging in a way to access it. But I think if people spend the time with it to get to know the poems and understand it themselves, that itself is an act of kind of understanding and work that goes into it to kind of see things from other perspectives.
Yes. Our final question before we wrap up. In what ways do you hope to foster inclusion in your communities through your writing?
I was going to start, I think it's just to keep writing, I think. The more that we can put out books and are proud of them, and then the more readers that can hold those books and read them will kind of hopefully see themselves reflected in those books that I didn't see myself in. And I think that's for me, that's all kind of boils down to.
Huge. It's a huge thing, yeah. Tarek?
I think because we are all educators, when we are writing, we are educating, we are raising awareness. Especially when I was writing this one, Chanting Denied Shores, no one had written about the Komagata Maru in a novel form, in a detailed form. So my main drive was to educate and to bring these issues out into the open. And since then, other people have taken this task on, and it has spread from there. So one of the aspects of writing is to raise awareness, social awareness, and bring tolerance. You bring tolerance. Intolerance is lack of education, simple as that. The minute you look into any issue in detail, you understand it better, you relate to it, and that feeling sort of dissipates.
Thanks, Tarek. Jillian?
Yeah, this is a really great question. The Quebec Writers Federation, they started a mentorship program called the May Ruth Sarsfield mentorship program for underrepresented writers, and I was the inaugural mentor for that, and I worked with a emerging poet named Faith Perret, and I was very honored to be asked to do that. I've been very, just as a woman of color, I've been very sensitive to these questions of diversity, of inclusion. Natalie Zed put out a really fascinating little blog post that was inspired by the Vita Count in 2011, where they talked about how many books of poetry were actually written by women, and were they being reviewed. And then just to try it out, she looked at National Post, and out of 14 reviews that year, only 2 were, reviews of books by women. And so when I am asked to review books, I will say I would really like to review writers who are, traditionally marginalized. So that is something that I put in the forefront of my reviews. When it comes to my picture books, I am very, I like to, again, I want to be paired with illustrators who are, again, marginalized. So I've worked with a lot of women of color. My second picture book is called My Love for You Is Always, and it's a dialogue between a mother and a son, and it's inspired by, Asian ingredients. And when they asked me about an illustrator, I just said, I really would love an illustrator who at least is familiar with these ingredients, because I want that sort of genuine connection. So I've been very, very fortunate to work with those illustrators. I worked with Michelle Lee, I've worked with Nino Mata, who's Filipino-American. I have a book coming out in December with Naoko Stoop, who's Japanese-American, so I'm very excited about that. In 2018, there was another, for those of you who like statistics, in 2018 they did another count in terms of representation and characters in picture books. And in 2018, which is not that long ago, there were more animal characters in books published that year than all BIPOC characters combined. Yeah. And so that is, again, something that I find really important when I write my picture books, is to have that representation. I want to make sure that the books I put out, will be reflected in the readers that are out there. And so those are some concrete examples of things that I think about and do.
Great examples. And of course, LiterASIAN is all about inclusivity and inclusion, and has been doing it for over 10 years. So thank you so much, Alan, and the Asian Canadian Writers Workshop, and to the Dr. Sun Yat-sen Gardens for fostering this inclusion here today. And thank you all for attending this fantastic panel. Give a hand for David Lee, Tariq Malik, and Jillian C. Thank you so much. So I'm going to give you, the writers will stay here for a moment while you buy their books, so you can get them signed here for a few minutes, and then we'll take a photograph with the poets soon. So please, there's still some cake, and there's some tea, and there's some books.